Silent Hill. In most of my videos so far, you may have heard me bring it up, possibly to an annoying degree, but that is for good reason. Silent Hill as a franchise, the original game, is one of my all-time favorite video game series ever. The second game in particular is a story and gameplay experience that I genuinely have thought about nearly every day since I played it for the first time when I was about 13 years old. I found a copy of Silent Hill 1 at a used game store for the cheap, and beat it almost right after I beat 2, and I couldn't find a copy of Silent Hill 3 on the cheap, so I had to beat it on a pirated PC copy years after the fact. You would assume that I would have played all the mainline series games, especially one made by the original Team Silent, and the last one made by them at that, but no, I never have. Silent Hill 4 has been labeled as the black sheep of the original 4 games, as it is obviously an experimental take on the Silent Hill formula. I have attempted to play through Silent Hill 4 on several occasions, probably upwards of 4 times at this point, but each time I couldn't get past the changes that the game had made to the series that I had loved so much, and usually around the time that I entered the water prison was the point that I gave up. But over the years, I would constantly hear through subreddits and fan sites that quite a few people consider the room as the best in the franchise, and I saw enough of these opinions that made me always feel like I was missing something. Like, I had to be, right? It's one of my favorite franchises, still made by the people who created it before Konami fucked their way in and gave it to any random studio that happened to not be dead. When I decided to make Silent Hill 4 the topic of this video, I figured that I would be able to get to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and not only finish the game, but also close the chapter on my life and finish the last entry by Team Silent that I had still left in the ditch. But as I played through it this time, I began to appreciate a lot of little things that the team had either focused on or accidentally put a spotlight on for me to notice. Things like the exceptional camera work, the much more claustrophobic feel of the game, and the supremely messed up storyline. But the thing that I grew to appreciate most of all was the way that Silent Hill 4 constantly messes with your expectations. Almost everything that you become comfortable with is messed with in some form or fashion, and I want to talk about it. I think in order to really talk about what makes Silent Hill 4 so special, we have to go over what formula the original 3 games presented and perfected. Silent Hill, up to the point of the release of The Room, was structured around what I have detailed into these easily to digest bullet points. Silent Hill up to this point used the radio as a way to build tension by having the radio blaring distorted static when enemies were nearby. The tension would arise usually from being unable to see the enemies that were nearby due to them being around the corner or hidden in darkness. Hearing the radio go off and not being able to see the monsters usually brings that feeling of dread that only helps enhance the psychological horror that the game does so well. The flashlight and the radio basically go hand in hand. It was one of the things that helped it immediately stand out from games like Resident Evil that were dominating the horror genre at the time, with its use of pre-rendered static backgrounds. Starting in Silent Hill 2, on the power of the PS2, meant that it could incorporate real-time shadow effects that, honestly, still look really good, and only were made better on its sequel. It's essentially the visual equivalent to the audio staple of the radio when it comes to the Silent Hill series. It's almost common knowledge at this point that the first game in the series used fog as a graphical workaround because the power of the PS1 was so limited. The fog masked the pop-ins that would naturally come with the PS1 trying to render an entire town as you walked through it. It quickly became a series staple by the second game, and became a defining feature of the franchise. If you saw fog in a horror game after the release of Silent Hill 1, it was almost ubiquitous with having been influenced by it. While the comparison between Zelda and Silent Hill might seem a little weird, I genuinely think that the world map is set up somewhat like the classic Zelda series. I often consider the abandoned buildings that you walk through more or less like dungeons in the original Zelda games, with puzzles and their own puzzle box sort of feel a la Resident Evil, where you were constantly unable to progress until you unlock a specific item or weapon, in which forth you can progress towards completion of these areas. Probably the most reliable example of this is the box puzzle in the Otherworld of Silent Hill 2. You need 4 separate things to open this box. You need the lapis eye key, you need the imprint on carbon paper code, you need the turn the numbers code, and you need the purple bowl key. And once you open the box, all that you find in there is a piece of hair that you use to combine with a fish hook to get an item out of a shower drain that you can then use to progress through the rest of the hospital. The Otherworld in Silent Hill is almost as synonymous with the game and town as the fog itself. It almost feels like a rearranged mode of many of the game's dungeons, with new enemy placement, some new areas, and a completely redesigned visual aesthetic. One that famously utilizes the combination of rust, blood, metal, and flesh. One of the key aspects of the Otherworld is that the player has no control of when they encounter it. It is usually forced upon the player, usually when they reach the halfway point of whatever location that they are in. And sometimes it ends up bleeding into the town itself. Notably in Silent Hill 1 after you leave the hospital, and Silent Hill 2 before you enter the Historical Society. I don't think it's any secret at this point that Silent Hill was originally conceived to be a Resident Evil style clone game. But either due to incompetence or the lack of motivation from the team, Konami eventually sort of just gave up on enforcing this concept, which allowed the team to do basically whatever they wanted, which led to sort of an American Gothic type of horror interpreted by the Japanese mindset. Which, if you ask me, is where the best sort of horror can come from. Not necessarily from just the Japanese viewpoint, but specifically in where one culture takes on another's. Because due to this non-matching viewpoint, you get these really off sort of takes on other cultures. As an American viewing America through the eyes of someone from Japanese culture, I can tell you that the game produces an almost uncanny valley effect quite a few times, which I only think help adds to the horror atmosphere. Silent Hill wasn't as reliant on fixed cameras as its counterpart Resident Evil, but it used them sparingly and effectively. One of the most memorable uses of this is from the first game where you're getting your bearings into the town and first stumble into the Otherworld. Most of the time, however, you are playing from a distant third-person camera perspective, which was commonplace at the time. Don't forget that this was before Resident Evil 4. The camera work in the original 3 Silent Hill games was a good example of less is more. It wasn't used frequently, but when it was used, you noticed it and you felt it. Traversing Silent Hill was a key component of Silent Hill 1 and 2. The team began experimenting slightly with the third entry by having a lot of the areas that you explore in the first half of the game not even take place in Silent Hill. One of the best things about Silent Hill itself was that it felt like a character pulling the strings of many of the game's events. Constant interruptions such as huge gaping holes in the street, outside interventions such as audio or video clips, hieroglyphic style wording in its puzzle that felt like the town itself knew who it was toying with. Silent Hill 2 in particular is probably the strongest that the town felt like it was intervening. Walking around the town, especially the first time through each game, feels like wandering around a maze, and also feels like a proto-open world game with the way that it is designed. You could go anywhere in the town that you wanted, so long as the streets were available, and in some cases you would even find hidden areas or items. These are what I believe to be the main gameplay elements of Silent Hill that made it different from so many of its contemporaries. No, I'm not forgetting the heavy psychological influence storytelling or the emotional connection that is most likely why the series is so fondly remembered. These points that I have highlighted are specifically gameplay elements, and especially ones that I want to focus on for talking about Silent Hill 4. Team Silent didn't just aim to craft a game that was a little bit different, or be satisfied with having a few gameplay tweaks here and there, or even just a new mechanic or two, but they set out to make a game that truly took the series in a new direction. Horror is at its best when it plays with your expectations and surprises you. Silent Hill 4, as an entry in the franchise, is constantly messing with what you know as a Silent Hill game. This is actually pretty huge when you think about it. The radio has become so synonymous with Silent Hill, it would be like taking out the use of a sword in Zelda. What this means for the game is that the enemy encounters will actually often shock the player more often and lead to many resounding gotcha moments with enemy placement. The water prison in particular has some of the best enemy placements of the game that actually led me to yelp out loud a few times. I'm sure that a few people, when the game was new, were going about the story just waiting to pick up the radio and slowly getting more and more worried when they realized that it wasn't coming. The lack of a flashlight is a concept that on paper seems kind of baffling. The game trades off the darkness for plenty of well-lit areas. Now, how can you make the game as eerie or as tense without putting the player in darkness? Well, Team Silent accomplishes this on a multitude of ways, but the most obvious that I can give offhand is that it has the heaviest use of the grain filter on the screen, which renders a lot of the far-off areas pretty hard to make out. The apartments in particular use the long hallways to very good effect, where sometimes you can't quite make out what exactly is at the far end of the hallway, and it can turn out to be quite unsettling. The visual namesake of Silent Hill for the most part is pretty much absent. There are a few key spots here and there where the fog comes back in a very visually pleasing way, and times that it helps add to the ambience of some of the game's locations. But I would say that the game uses fog at least half as much, if not even less than that. Even when you're in the other world and are outside, there are several points and locations where there is actually just zero fog. It helps reinforce the fact that Silent Hill 4 is attempting to stand on its own and helps the game establish its own visual style. The first-person camera is literally the first thing that you see, and if you aren't expecting it, then what a shock to the system it is. Even though it's only utilized inside your apartment, the development team managed to find a new way to frighten and unsettle you with such a little change. I'll go over in more detail why the camera switch is such a game changer, but for now, just know that it makes some of the later areas of the game a nightmare. I would also make the argument that 4 has the best camera in the franchise. I don't mean the camera that you control, but I mean the use of the camera angles, the shot composition, etc. Long shots that follow you through a long hallway, the way it positions itself to fuck with your head when you walk into a room with audio, some of the most interesting shots, just period, etc., etc. I'm actually just going to combine these 2 points since they go so well together. Your apartment is essentially your safe zone, and the only place that you can save the game at. The only way that you can even get to the other world at all is through the hole in the wall in your apartment. And once you arrive in the other world, you're not really exploring the town, but essentially going through ordered levels that are predetermined by what point of the game you're in. It's an interesting trade-off where you have control of when you enter the other world this time around, but are completely at the game's mercy when it comes to where you end up. The game utilizes traversal to and from your apartment in an interesting way on occasion, as in an occasional puzzle solution or another new mechanic, an item box a la Resident Evil. The end result is an interesting mix-up that I can see being the inspiration for Origin's mirror traversal mechanic. This is definitely a lesser change, but one that I feel that should still be taken note of. In case you aren't quite following what I mean, a puzzle box style dungeon is one that is based around being only able to progress up to a certain point until you either get an item or solve a puzzle, which will allow you to slowly progress outward, expanding the areas as you go. Each new checkpoint unfolds the rest of the level. The individual levels that you go to through the portal in your apartment are much, much smaller and don't nearly feel as thorough as the other game's dungeons. such as the Brookhaven Hospital in Silent Hill 3. The water prison feels like the most classic area that you go to, but while you're there, a majority of the time you spend there is either going through all of the cells to find items, or waiting for Eileen to catch up to you on the spiral walkways. I think that this one is overall pretty subtle, but the team admitted to taking more influences from their home country this time around to help spice up the formula a little bit. I'm not from Japan, obviously, so I can't say for certain about everything, but I think it's pretty obvious that they took a more Japanese-style horror approach than an American one. The most obvious example are the ghosts and the much more overt spiritual horror tones. The ghost of Cynthia in particular looks like she could have come straight out of The Grudge. Now these are a lot of series subversions, but that isn't everything. What makes Silent Hill 4 such a masterclass of subversion is its genius use of the apartment itself and its own formula that its own gameplay sets up. I'm doing this one first because it could really just fit into the previous section, but since the point I'm trying to make is so integral to Silent Hill 4 specifically, I'm going to leave it here. In games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, it becomes quickly apparent that all items that are pick-upable, I don't know if that's a word or not, are worthwhile, and even though they may be optional, they will only add to your arsenal or be a key item toward solving a puzzle. Silent Hill 4 has an item called the Shabby Doll that you receive in the Otherworld apartments. It's given to you by Walter before you realize exactly who he is. And right before he gives it to you, he says something kinda cryptic, which on my playthrough led me to believe that you may need it later in the level. But all it does is trigger a specific haunt that you do not want to have happen in your apartment, as it affects the area right above your item box. In Silent Hill 4, there are no save rooms in the main game except for the desk in your apartment. It also becomes clear very early on that health drinks are a finite resource and not nearly as abundant as the original 3 games. You realize why this is, as while you are inside your apartment, your health auto-regenerates. It's slow, but it still happens. It also becomes a routine after a short while of gameplay that every time you come back to your real apartment, that you wake up, you go save, you check the windows, you check under the door, you check the peephole, and then you check the hole in your living room, spying into Eileen's room. Oh great, might as well use those health drinks while I'm out and stay in Silent Hill as long as possible since, won't need to worry about healing. A little bit around the halfway point of the game, you start seeing horrific things occurring in your apartment. The first-person camera that is utilized while inside your apartment only makes the hauntings that much more visceral, and most horrifically of all, you are no longer able to heal, which in turn makes the limited healing items so much more valuable, and by the end of the game you are praying for just another nutrition drink. The routine that you develop is actually severely hampered by the haunts because they can actually damage you, which makes the comfort that you felt in your apartment absolutely void. Even before the hauntings start, the routine is interrupted by Eileen's Robbie doll, seemingly possessed, pointing at you, almost like a harbinger of things to come. This becomes a very early precedent after the first location that you go to through the portal in your bathroom. You meet Cynthia in the subway, and by the end of it you find her dead, covered in blood, and a number carved into her skin. This is a pattern that repeats over and over until you get to the Otherworld apartment. You barge into Eileen's room after hearing her screaming and find her also covered in blood with another number carved into her. You may think that this is just another victim of the 21 Sacraments, but Eileen is the break in the pattern. She doesn't actually die, it becomes an integral part of the gameplay after this point. While escorting Eileen through the second half of the game, you sort of believe either that she is invincible, since you don't see a health bar for her, or that the game just doesn't tell you when she can die. Now I'm presuming this next point that I'm about to make, but I think most people will develop one of two playstyles when Eileen is following you around. One, the safe and pre-planned route. This one is under the assumption that Eileen could die and utilizes leaving her in safe rooms and locations that you go to. It is very conservative with bringing Eileen anywhere, and may also result in not giving her any weapons at all, because her AI is not great. Alright, I have like 0 health. Just please keep following me, Eileen. Eileen! Oh my god! What are you... Walter's right behind you. If I save you, I'm gonna die! Ah! Eileen! Please come back. Please. Oh, this is so fucked. Or just have Eileen tank damage. This is pretty self-explanatory. If you don't believe that she can die, you may just bring her along everywhere and have her take a bunch of damage while you take care of the monsters that you encounter. The game plays with your expectations yet again by making this presumption sorta wrong. Eileen can't die, but she can become possessed through damage, which makes the ending of the game much harder if she does actually become more possessed. With no previous knowledge of the story or the game, you would be forgiven to think that the ghosts are just another monster. But when you come back to the subway station and find Cynthia's ghost, you realize quickly that the ghosts aren't just any old Silent Hill monster, but the victims that Walter has killed over the course of his 21 Sacraments murder spree. This may seem like a cool small detail until you realize that all of the areas that you've been to beforehand and will have to come back to are now going to be inhabited by these ghosts, making the areas that much more stressful. It also makes you empathize with a Silent Hill monster, which is kind of insane. Right at the beginning of the game, the portal into the otherworld forces its way into Henry's bathroom, and it becomes your only way there. After each level, it gets bigger and bigger. At one point, the bathtub suddenly becomes stained with blood, which only adds to the creep factor, and after a little while, you expect the entire bathroom wall to disappear, and possibly forcibly teleport you every time you enter the bathroom. But no. After a certain point, you walk into the bathroom expecting to have another trip into the otherworld, but you find that the whole wall has been completely filled with cement, totally blocking your way in. When this happened to me, I was taken aback. I wandered around my apartment waiting for the audio cue to let me know when it opened back up, but it never happened. The rest of the game you have to go through another hole that opens up in your laundry room, and only after solving a simple puzzle. The map layouts of many of the locations that you go to in Silent Hill 4 are a lot smaller than the average size of the places that you visit in the rest of the series. The other apartments and the water prison are probably the biggest areas in the game, but the wish house, the hospital, the Ashfield station, and the hotel are all relatively small comparatively. You also notice that there are some things that you feel like you missed out on doing, such as the big watermill in the prison, and when you leave them, you may feel like you may have missed out on something important. Around the halfway point, after the apartments, you start to feel like the game will just be a greatest hits of sorts when it comes to rotations of levels. But after you rescue Eileen from the hospital, you explore all of the areas all over again, but this time with expanding and new areas previously locked off. And when you come back to these locations, not only do you have to fight new, more frequent enemy placement, but you have to escort Eileen through all of these locations. All of these elements come together that make an experience that is overall very unsettling, especially for someone familiar with the series beforehand. As the years have gone on, I have seen more and more appreciation for this entry in the series. As I said in the beginning of the video, I came to appreciate a lot of the small things about Silent Hill 4. And this time around, because of that, I fell in love with the game. But I hope that if you still haven't been able to gain the respect and have it stand up against the original 4 games, I hope that this video has been able to help you admire what the team was able to accomplish in such a short amount of time, from Silent Hill 3 to The Room. When the credits rolled, I was happy that I was able to finally say that I finished all 4 of the Team Silent tetralogy, but also sad knowing that there wasn't going to be any more first-time plays of the game, at least not for a long while. Thank you for watching. Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to people that helped with the points of Silent Hill, specifically Tita, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, on Reddit, and Karmatrine on Reddit as well, and then CM Lincoln, who is also on Reddit and who also has a dope ass YouTube page. The channel name is Halleck, H-A-L. I'll put a link in the description. Have a good one. Please don't want this ending to age poorly. Please give us another Team Silent game. Konami, I will take back almost everything I've ever said about you. Please, just please.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.